The fight for justice has revolutionised the modern political world. Serfs and slaves have been emancipated from their bondage. Women and ethnic minorities have been endowed with inalienable rights, and individuals are no longer persecuted for their sexual orientation nor their religious beliefs. As a society, we have went to war to champion the importance of the individual and to promote the social and political conditions needed for individuals of all backgrounds to flourish. However, as we have progressed forward in certain frontiers, we have fallen backwards in others, as the greatest casualty of war is humanity itself. In the trenches, as we sink into the soil and blood beneath us, and into the conflict and turmoil that surrounds us, we fail to see the glint of the individual in the eye of the other. A universe of feelings, memories, ideas, hopes and beliefs are narrowed down to a single point. The individual in front of us is seen as merely an opponent, someone in opposition to our beliefs, someone that stands in the way of a better, more just world. The pursuit of justice, when taken to an extreme, even with noble intentions at heart, dehumanises others and divests our opponents of their individuality. As the West has become increasingly polarised, we have taken an ever more contemptuous view of our political opponents. We have lost the ability to meaningfully engage with those we disagree with. We live in parallel worlds, predicated on different facts, different moral considerations, and different views on how to live, with seemingly no hope of bridging these worlds together. The purpose of this video is not to outline how the West became so polarised. To understand that, I would recommend reading Ezra Klein's Why We're Polarised, but rather to understand how the ideological quest for justice can lead to the widespread dehumanisation of those we disagree with. However, it is important to note, as Ezra Klein does, that one of the key drivers of political polarisation, the tendency for people on opposite sides of the political spectrum to have increasingly negative views of others and for their opinions to increasingly diverge, was the 1950 paper released by the American Political Science Association titled Towards a More Responsible Two-Party System, which argued that the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States were too similar for the electorate to make an intelligent choice between them, encouraging both parties to develop clearer ideological commitments and policy suggestions. Indeed, polarisation is an important feature of political parties when we consider the function of a party, rather than seeking our input on every political issue. Parties instead represent and translate the electorate's political values into policy. Indeed, clear differences between parties are necessary for the functioning of democracy, but in the 21st century, we are living in an age of extreme polarisation that is eroding the very fabric of democracy. Political stress in the United States is at an all-time high. According to Peter Turchin and John Gladstone, who developed the Political Stress Index, America is experiencing levels of political stress that are higher than during the build-up to the Civil War and have been climbing exponentially from 2010 onwards. Moreover, according to a poll conducted by Pew Research, 45% of Republicans and 42% of Democrats view the opposing party as a threat to the nation's well-being. We are becoming increasingly less likely to have a favourable view of those we disagree with. Indeed, in an era of political activation and activism, perhaps this is to be expected. In a study conducted by the psychologists Christopher Johnson and Christopher Federico and Howard Levine, they found that disengaged citizens had less of a fixed political identity based on their own psychological profile. They were more pragmatic and practical when presented with a question. Such individuals reacted to policy proposals by answering, "What will this proposal do for me?" Meanwhile, those that are more politically engaged were more likely to try and answer, "What will supporting this policy say about me?" This line of thinking pushes people towards forming allegiances with others based on common values and a shared sense of identity, and ultimately towards increasingly fixed political tribes that share a common ideology, with neither side able to jolt the rusted gears of the political machine and pass laws that they so desire. Both sides have instead been reduced to warring languages and symbols as they espouse one set of ideals or another. But we must ask, what is it that determines whether an individual identifies with Republican or Democratic ideals, with conservative or liberal principles? Accounting for all of the variables that determines our political affiliation is beyond the scope of this video, but one key insight from the psychologist Jonathan Haidt in his book The Righteous Mind is that our genetics determines between 1/3 and 1/2 of political differences in a group, which is more than the politics of the household that we are raised in. Indeed, what these genes partly determine are first of all our psychological characteristics, such as our attraction to novelty, our disgust reflex, and our threat sensitivity. With left-leaning individuals being more open to novelty, while right-leaning individuals are more sensitive to threats and to feelings of disgust. Additionally, our genes also partly determine our visceral attitude towards each of the 6 moral dials. These may include the moral dial of harm, fairness, loyalty, authority, liberty, and sanctity. Our sensitivity to each of these moral instincts mould many of the political views that we come to express, with liberals laying greater emphasis on the concerns of harm and fairness, while conservatives are more in tune with concerns of loyalty, authority, liberty, and sanctity. As Jonathan Haidt remarks, much of what passes for the daily scrum of electoral politics is merely an effort to find language that can help citizens justify these instincts. Once people join a political team, they get ensnared in its moral matrix. They see confirmation of their grand narrative everywhere. Indeed, this poses a deeper question, however. If much of our politics is embedded in the very structure of our DNA, how should we view those that believe in ideals and proposals that we disagree with and maybe even find reprehensible? As the former Democrat Andrew Yang states, this strikes me as a real blind spot for many progressives. Many liberals would not dream of berating someone for the circumstances of their birth or what they would consider immutable parts of their identity like race and gender, but they might not feel the same about someone who voted for Trump or approved of a particular Supreme Court nominee. Partisan animosity is one of the few forms of discrimination that contemporary American society not only permits but actively encourages. As Yang remarks, this blind spot dramatically fuels division because many conservatives feel that they are constantly being dismissed as uneducated rubes and their moral language is not worthy of consideration. As we have become more politically activated in the modern climate of activism, we have become ever more predisposed to find others who think like us, who share our ideals and our moral concerns. And the splintering of traditional media and the advent of social media has provided the perfect platform in which to construct such echo chambers. We went from a handful of TV channels to a galaxy of competing media outlets, all competing for your attention, from email and instant messaging to an age of social media that can track your emotional state and use machine learning algorithms to present you with targeted headlines designed to trigger an emotional response. As the data ethicist Tristan Harris notes, fake news spreads at 6 times the rate of factually accurate news, and it does so because it makes us feel something. It conjures feelings of disgust, moral outrage, it confirms our biases, and directs our bile towards those that we now come to see with contempt. In an effort to confirm our own biases and to feel justified in our own moral beliefs, both sides of the political divide have adopted anti-scientific views, denouncing the validity of COVID vaccinations on one side, while the other asserts that there are no biological differences between men and women. As Yang writes, we currently thrive on conflict, on characters, on casting someone else as wrong, immoral, racist, or closed-minded, and ourselves as clear-eyed in fighting for what is right. In fighting for what is right, we have reduced the political arena into a war of words, where we bludgeon our opponents into submission with a torrent of insults, labelling all liberals as libtards, snowflakes, social justice warriors, and all conservatives as xenophobes, Tory scum, and alt-right. When a relationship between two lovers descends into an exchange of personal attacks and insults, we rightfully describe such a relationship as abusive and toxic. But when both sides of the political spectrum descend into such an exchange, we remain silent. All relationships are fundamentally relationships between individuals, and we cannot excuse the toxicity of our political discourse simply because it seems further removed from ourselves, or because it appears to be more abstract. Individuals are always the perpetrators and the victims, but instead we deny the complexity of the individual and we label them according to some perceived group characteristics. As soon as we label the individual, we negate them. Indeed, as Jean-Paul Sartre argues in Being and Nothingness, the essence of the individual, the subject, is called the being for itself. It is its freedom to transcend their own circumstances. We establish new goals, acquire new skills, and change our view of the world, whereas inanimate objects, what Sartre calls being in itself, are simply defined by their characteristics, and they cannot transcend their nature. A rock, by its own accord, can only be a rock. By labelling others, especially in a derogatory manner, we deny their capacity to grow. We dehumanise them by seeing them as fixed objects. Objects that cannot be reconciled with, but must simply be overcome. They are objects of injustice, hurdles on the path to a better world. We come to see these individuals as objects of a similar kind and categorise them together as part of a large group, depending on their shared characteristics. Every Trump voter is deplorable, and every Biden voter is woke. We cannot define individuals by their collective characteristics without sowing division and normalising dehumanisation. We experience the world as individuals that may or may not be tied to a collective, not the other way around. When engaging with others in this frame of mind, where it's us versus them, we come to distort reality. As the social identity theorist Henry Tajfel notes, we come to accentuate the differences between ourselves and others in what is called the accentuation effect. Indeed, when engaging with others outside our own group, we represent them in an exaggerated and stereotyped manner. Moreover, groups that are hostile and ideologically opposed to one another also tend to display even greater accentuation effects than groups that are not hostile to one another. The truth cannot be clearly seen through the red mist of anger and hostility. In the heat of conflict, we are more, not less, likely to emphasise the worst in each other. As the French philosopher Simone Weil writes in The Need for Roots, so it is that the transmission of truths among people depends entirely on the state of their feelings, and the same applies to no matter what kind of truth. If we wish to see our politics informed by the truth, then we need an emotional reset on our political discourse. Otherwise, polarisation will deepen, and we will continue to implicitly regard others as something less than human. Life is not a battle between good and evil, between masters and slaves. But as Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote in the Gulag Archipelago, the line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. The more we continue to separate people according to their political affiliations and point out their differences, the more divided and less trusting we will become. Conversely, the more we emphasise common goals and interests and a shared sense of humanity, the closer our communities will become and the more we will come to see each other as human beings. The line between good and evil cuts through every heart. Yet the dynamic of our politics is to judge our opponents according to their failures and their moments of moral impropriety, while emphasising our own success and ignoring our own moral limitations. As Carl Jung described, each of us contains a shadow side, that repressed part of our psyche that harbours all of the personal characteristics and experiences that we are too ashamed to admit to ourselves, such as our own failures, the moments in which we slip into temptation and selfishness. It is only when each of us realises that we are capable of evil that we can hope to prevent it. Human nature contains both light and dark, good and evil, and by reflecting upon our own limitations, we can come to accept ourselves and others, and ultimately take a more balanced and accurate view of the social world. Many of the problems we face are the result of larger systemic factors. However, the most important thing we can do as individuals is more personal. And the just society is filled not only with just institutions, but with just individuals. Individuals that see the social world in what Iris Murdoch called a loving and just manner. The pursuit of individual rights has done untold good for the Western world, but we have become hardened and defensive in our endeavours. As Iris Murdoch notes, by opening our eyes, we do not necessarily see what confronts us. We are anxiety-ridden animals. Our minds are continually active, fabricating an anxious, usually self-preoccupied, often falsifying veil which partially conceals the self. Indeed, as the Neo-Confucian philosopher Wang Yangmin notes, humanity shares one original nature, a Ben Jing, that we are all connected to one another and the world around us. However, we fail to realise how interwoven we are with others by the fact that our minds are embodied in physical forms that separates us from and tends to generate misleading impressions of the world around us. Our judgment is clouded by such a fixation on our own desires, needs, and instincts, and the need to justify our moral instincts, as John van Heydt reminds us of. Indeed, as the veil of the self clouds our own vision, we come to see ourselves as independent and separated from those we are intimately connected to. Murdoch continues on to write that, in the moral life, the enemy is the fat, relentless ego. Moral philosophy, as properly and in the past, has sometimes been the discussion of this ego and the techniques for its defeat. However, by restraining the fat, relentless ego and the impulses of the self, we can come to see the world more accurately. Iris Murdoch offers a technique for piercing through the veil of the self in her example of the daughter-in-law, writing that a mother feels hostility to her daughter-in-law. The mother finds the daughter quite a good-hearted girl, but while not exactly common, yet certainly unpolished and lacking in dignity and refinement. The daughter is inclined to be pert and familiar, insufficiently ceremonious, brusque, sometimes positively rude, always tiresomely juvenile. The mother does not like the daughter's accent or the way the daughter dresses. The mother feels that her son has married beneath him. Thus much for the mother's thoughts about tea. As time passes, and it could be that the mother settles down with a hardened sense of grievance and a fixed picture of the daughter, imprisoned by the cliché, my poor son has married a silly, vulgar girl. However, the mother of the example is an intelligent and well-intentioned person, capable of self-criticism, capable of giving careful and just attention to an object which confronts her. The mother tells herself, I am old-fashioned and conventional. I may be prejudiced and narrow-minded. I may be snobbish. I am certainly jealous. Let me look again. Here I assume that the mother observes the daughter until gradually her vision of the daughter alters. The daughter is discovered not to be vulgar, but refreshingly simple, not undignified, but spontaneous, not noisy, but gay, not tiresomely juvenile, but delightfully youthful, and so on. In this anecdote, in order for the mother to see the daughter in a loving and just manner, she must reflect upon the limitations of herself, and subsequently she lowers her defences, opens up and allows herself to become more vulnerable. By piercing the veil of the self, she sees herself more clearly and allows herself to be seen more clearly in order to see her daughter-in-law as she is. In order to become more vulnerable, we must cultivate a rich internal ethic by engaging in a range of self-forgetting practices, whether it be prayer or appreciating art and the beauty of the natural world. We must direct our attention away from the brooding self to what is beyond us, a range of practices I have discussed in my previous video on narcissism. In the war of words, as two soldiers draw their weapons on one another, We can only hope to see each other in a loving and just manner by lowering our defences and disarming ourselves. If we do not keep our selfish impulses in check, they will keep us in tow, but rather, by coming to see how intimately connected we are, like the limbs of a body that must cooperate to function as one, and by coming to appreciate that many of our moral instincts and intuitions are genetically endowed, and by practicing loving and just attention, we can come to see that each of us harbours both light and dark. If we wish to see the glint of humanity in others, we must look deeper into our own shadow and more selflessly at the light that we all radiate. If you've liked this video and want to see more videos on how philosophy can help us study society, then please share, subscribe and like the video. Thank you.